Okay, good early afternoon, colleagues. It's a great pleasure to have a Forestry Department to host this little information session on the recent, quite alarming announcement from the IPCC's Special Report. And we have three distinguished guests here, two IPCC authors and Maria Sanchez, who will give some insights to what those results from the special report mean to forestry, to give really have an opportunity for us to discuss them directly. But before I go to introduce to them, I would like to invite our ADG, Hiroto Mitsugi, Assistant Director General of the Forestry Department, to have a few opening remarks. Hiroto, over to you.
Good afternoon. So time is so short, so I have to shorten my remarks. But anyway, so thank you very much for having to attend this meeting and event. So this is an occasion on having this IPCC authors meeting here in FAO. So we have seen already the quite alarming news provided by IPCC Special Report, Global Warming 1.5 degrees. So it was launched at the beginning of this October, and so which provide us information on several pathways, and also requiring that the global action to avoiding that further to response to the serious threat of climate change. So, so the report highlight quite a number of the climate change impact that could be avoided by limiting the global warming 1.5 degrees compared with 2 degrees and more. So, today we have quite special guest, so researchers, which just guiding us that what this report talking about it. And then so at the same time, I very much welcome to all of you, and also to know that your attendance is showing that our willingness and interest to further our work to tackle with climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hiroto. And I know that we have quite strict time schedule, given also the strike today, that colleagues actually have to take trains, the presenters in particular, some of them. So let us go directly to the program. So we have two presentations. They are the IPCC authors, and I'm happy to introduce Dr. Joanna House. Joanna is a reader in environmental science and policy. She's a co-chair of the Global Change team in the Cabot Institute of the Environment, and she's director of the master's program in climate change science and policy at the Bristol University. Her research topic is land sector and climate change. She's particularly interested in ensuring the credibility of MRV. So we have her presentation, then followed by another presentation or some remarks by Dr. Robert Matthews. Robert is the science group leader of the Forest Mensuration, Modelling and Forecasting Science Group at the Forest Research in the UK. Has worked in such research over 30 years and very well internationally known for forest carbon dynamics research. He is also an IPCC lead author, like is Joanna, actually, for many reports. So, and afterwards we will be hearing another presentation, and I'll introduce Maria Sanchez after that. But Joanna, over to you.
Because I actually started my research career. For my undergraduate project, I had to go out to Borneo and measure trees, and was very into forests. So I'm particularly pleased. Oh, is this one not working? Is this? Yeah, I think. Is that? Can everyone hear me? Okay. Yeah, so spending time in the forest measuring trees and then in savannas, and that's kind of simply where I've gone, although it's a long time since I've got out into the field. But I appreciate being here with foresters today. And as you said, I'm on many IPCC reports. I'm going to talk to you about the 1.5 report results today. I wasn't actually directly involved with that one as an author, but I'm currently an author on the methods refinement, which we're all doing here, and on the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land that's going to come out next year. And we're just preparing our second order draft. And when that comes out, it'd be fantastic if as many of you as possible can review it and make sure that we're kind of addressing your concerns and saying, doing the right things with it. And then also we've got the 6th assessment report cycle that's just started, and I'm on the AFOLU chapter for that. And we're due to have our first meeting next year. So yeah, a lot of IPCC to do, and so apologies, I have put this together fairly quickly, and I can't talk for everything in the 1.5 report, but I'll do my best. So the main messages of today is to show you really what the role of forests is in the 1.5 report, and it does see quite a large role with forests. There's lots of questions about how realistic the scenarios are in that, and I'll touch on that, but I know we want to have some more discussion, and Maria has some comments. And also that countries also see a large role for forests in their pledges under the Paris Agreement. And so the key here is how you maximise the sustainable potential in forests while avoiding the worst trade-offs. So the Paris Agreement signed in 2015, the aspects of that I'm going to focus on are these countries' pledges, these nationally determined contributions, and the role of forests in those. Also, there's a lot of text in the Paris Agreement around sustainability that also touched on sustainability of mitigation. And so that's quite a key to it. And also sustainability in terms of other sustainable development goals. So there is this need to look for synergies and trade-offs between the different mitigation efforts. And then the targets of well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to 1.5, which of course is why we have the 1.5 special report, is to answer the exam question of how do we force the world to 1.5? And if we did it, what would that look like? And then is issues particularly for the land around the balance of emissions and removals, in the fact that the land's producing emissions, as are fossil fuels, but the land also removes those emissions, and how we can focus on reducing the emissions while maximising the removals. So what do we need to do? My talk is actually going to focus most on carbon dioxide rather than methane or nitrous oxide, the other two gases. And here's a little picture that gives you an idea of where we're at in the global carbon cycle and the different fluxes, the different anthropogenic fluxes of carbon dioxide. Over on the far left, you've got emissions from fossil fuels, and then you've also got emissions from land use change, which is primarily deforestation, but it's the net really of deforestation, afforestation, and forest management activity. And those land use change emissions account for about 11% of all anthropogenic emissions over about the last decade. At the same time, the land is a sink for carbon dioxide. And a lot of that's to do with the fact that carbon dioxide has a fertilizing effect on plants, so it's increased growth, and it's also to do with the climate change impacts on land where, for example, you've got longer growing seasons. So those anthropogenic perturbations of climate and atmospheric concentration of CO2 are actually promoting uptake by the land, and that's offsetting some of the emissions. It's taking up almost a third of emissions. And there's also some of the emissions are being taken up by the ocean, and the rest stays in the atmosphere. In order to limit to 1.5 degrees, there's a certain amount more carbon dioxide we can emit, and that's 750 gigatons of CO2 more we can emit to stay within 1.5. At the rate we're going to get there between about 2030 and 2052, so we're not far away. We haven't got long left. That 750 gigatons of carbon dioxide, it's about a quarter of what we could get out reasonably from fossil fuel reserves over the next 100 years. And then also just, so you can see that relative balance. So 2,700 gigatons of CO2 a year, that is what's stored in these fossil fuel reserves in terms of what can be extracted by the end of the century. And that's significantly less than we've got in vegetation and soils at the moment. So what can we do? We can protect forests, and I said I started my research career out measuring trees in Borneo, and here's one of the forest sites I worked in Borneo. So that place means quite a lot to me. It's my special place I kind of think about when I want to relax. But also here you'll notice the mist coming off the forest, and so I just wanted to make the point here about the extra services. I'm sure you all know that those forests give us, like biodiversity and rainfall recycling. And so this is what I'm talking about when I speak about the co-benefits of doing climate mitigation by protecting forests. Another co-benefit, say, of planting forests is reducing flooding. That's been a big issue. A couple of weekends ago in the UK, we had floods and landslides. So we've got an active forest planting programme to address that. And then reducing emissions. So that might be from the food sector, and particularly the issue around livestock isn't really so much the methane that they burp or fart out, but a lot more the land use that goes towards producing the feed to feed those, feed the livestock, because it takes about a ton of grain, 10 tons of grain, to produce 1 ton of meat. So that's a lot of grain that's got to be grown and a lot of deforestation that's driven. There's also quite a lot of waste in the food sector. It's about 30% waste going from farm to shop, and then about 30% waste from shop and consumer end. Other things we can do is we can grow trees and use the wood as a long-term carbon store, which in itself stores the carbon, but if that also offsets high carbon products like concrete, then you have an offset value as well. And then this issue of biomass energy with carbon capture and storage, which is one of the really controversial things I think about, important things that a lot of people have picked up on. So you grow your biomass, you take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, you then use it in a power plant. Like in the UK, we have the Drax power plant, which was originally a coal-fired power plant, and now they take a certain amount of biomass to do co-firing. You burn it, and then the CO2 you collect in carbon capture and storage systems, and then you bury that deep under the ground in geological reserves where you originally had oil or gas. And so that whole process is sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, putting it in the ground, and at the same time you're offsetting some fossil fuel emissions. You can also use the CCS technology generally with energy production. However, it does reduce the efficiency and increase costs, and it's still very much new technology. I think there's 2 demonstration power plants at the moment, and the costs are quite high, and they're using the CO2. They're not burying it yet, they're using it. So this is still very new technology. In the scenarios that I'm going to show you, they're talking about BECCS being deployed by about 2030. That's a very short time to go between demonstration technology and something that's deployed on a really large scale. So if we were going to do this, we'd have to be investing now to really push the development of that forward. So I want to talk to you for a minute now about what's actually already in the pledges, what countries are already planning to do under the Paris Agreement. So this is a paper led by Giacomo Grassi, who's sat over here, which we did together. And it shows the historical emissions from the historical flux from LULUCF, land use change and forestry, according to the greenhouse gas inventories that countries report to the UNFAO. And you see the historical flux is a source, and it's going down till it comes to a kind of imbalance around 2020. And then the blue lines going out are different future scenarios. So the blue line at the top is what countries said in their nationally determined contributions or in their country reporting of what would happen according to business as usual if they didn't implement various policies. So it goes up because of things like Brazil already has a forest policy of 80% reduction of Amazon deforestation by 2020 compared to 2005. And if you didn't include that policy, you'd end up with a business as usual. So that's why the business as usual is going up again. Because they don't consider that business as usual. They consider that something they're doing that's additional. The orange line is based on policies that are in place, kind of when we did the analysis, just prior to the NDCs kicking in. And then the other two lines are what the countries have said they would do in their pledges, their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And there's two different lines there, because one is what they said they would do anyway, unconditionally, and the lower line is what they've said they would do conditional on things like technology transfer and financial support. Overall, how you work out what that mitigation would be depends whether you're, say, comparing your end point in 2030 to where you're at in 2010, or what business as usual is, or where we are at with current policy. However, whichever way you look at it, as long as you're consistent in the way you look at the land sector versus other sectors, about a quarter of the mitigation that countries expect or have pledged under Paris, they expect to come from forests. That's primarily from reduced deforestation and afforestation and some forest management. So, for example, I already mentioned Brazil's forest code. Mexico have say in their NDC that they will have zero deforestation by 2030, and they'll also do afforestation and wetland protection. China have made a pledge about increasing stock volume in the forest to 4.5 billion meters squared. India, under the Green India mission, have said they'll enhance carbon sequestration in forests by 100 million tons of CO2 per year. Russia hasn't made a specific pledge about forests, but they say that forest management is the most important element of their NDC. And Gabon, again, another example of a pledge to reduce emissions by 50% over all sectors, with a lot of that considered to come from land management. So that was where we are at in the forest sector. And if you also look at where we're at with the pledges across all sectors, then this is what this figure is showing you. So we have a baseline again. We've got historical emissions now from all sectors, and we've got a baseline emissions, the kind of business as usual in grey, and that would take us to the end of the century to a warming of between 4 and 5 degrees. Then we've got our current policies in place, and then the pledges, what countries have said they'll do under the NDCs. And that takes us to about 3.2 degrees by the end of the century. So the current pledges go a long way to where we need to get to. They've already taken us down a lot, but they don't take us all the way. And if you look at the yellow and the green lines below, they are what is consistent. Those are the pathways consistent with getting to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. So you see, we've still got quite a way to go. So how do we get there? Now, there's a set of models called integrated assessment models that are used to explore these different pathways for getting to various targets. And the way they work is you start with a target, and they play about with, they look at population, GDP, technology transfer, demand for food, rate of technological development in different sectors. And they look at all various pathways and different things you can play about with to get to the same endpoint. So this is one example that I'm going to walk you through. In the grey bar, you've got your emissions going from current day out to 2100 from fossil fuel and industry. Those need to come down really rapidly. We're talking about major, rapid transformation of energy systems, transport, the way we organise cities, all kinds of things to get those fossil and industrial emissions down. The brown is showing you the emissions from agriculture, forestry, and other land use. At the moment, there's the AFOLU sector is a net source of emissions according to the global models, not according to the country accounting, and that's a different issue we can go into, but I don't think we'll have time. It's currently a sink, according to the model, a source, and it needs to come down to be a sink, so reducing deforestation, increasing afforestation, and then become a net sink, so net removals of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere after about 2030. And then there's this yellow chunk, which is what is expected to be able to come from bioenergy and carbon capture and storage in order to limit to 1.5 degrees. Now, that's one pathway of one sort of socioeconomic world. The modelers looked at lots of different socioeconomic worlds, and so lots of different ways we might look in the future in terms of GDP, population, technology transfer, to have different pathways. So for example, here at the top is a pathway that relies on innovation in energy, innovation in transport, innovation in society. It enables very much more rapid reduction of fossil fuel and industrial emissions, and it doesn't have to rely on BECCS at all. Below here is a scenario that really relies, it is a fossil fuel intensive scenario. So it takes longer to bring down fossil fuel emissions, they don't come down as much, relies much more heavily on biomass energy with carbon capture and storage into the future. And so less action now leaves more action legacy for future generations. And there's a number of these different pathways, and that's why when you say how much BECCS does it take to get to 1.5 degrees, well, the answer is between nothing and 760 million hectares worth, you know, depending on what pathway you follow. Now, 750 million hectares is quite a lot of land. It's almost twice the size of India. But, yeah, so, I mean, in that scenario, if we leave doing anything in fossil fuels till late and we end up relying on other sources, then they're talking about a large area of land use. Interestingly, if we don't have BECCS, the scenarios end up relying even more heavily on just conventional bioenergy as an offset for fossil fuels and on afforestation. So actually, you end up with even more land conversion in some of the scenarios with less BECCS. This is just picking out some detail now, and I won't go into these a lot because now the 1.5 report is available online and you can download these and have a look. This is just looking at the potential of different options. This is from a paper by Fuss et al. That came out just this year. And you see the potential here from afforestation and reforestation goes from about just under a half to just over 3.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide a year. That's out to 2050, I think that one is. And you can see BECCS is on there as well, biochar, soil carbon sequestration. DAX is direct air capture. It's a kind of chemical technique, and enhanced weathering on soils. This is a very detailed map, and again, a picture, I won't go into it, but I do recommend you to download the 1.5 report and you can have a look on the detail. I just wanted you to focus on the yellow bars, the second set of yellow bars, which is showing you the potential by 2050. And if we look, say, at AR at the bottom, afforestation, reforestation, it's the number in square brackets is saying the number of references in the literature there were. And these are bottom-up estimates. So these kind of go, how much land is available? What if we did this on it? What would we come up with? And that's just to give you an idea of the amount of literature there is and the abatement potential. The first figure we showed up just before is those purple dotted squares there. And the colouring is, the more intense colour means more of the available literature agrees around that level being a potential. So there's lots of literature about there. We're all trying to bring it through. And then the other thing I want to point out here is the side effects on the side, is we're also trying in the IPCC to look at these different co-benefits and also trade-offs. So, for example, trade-off with food production or trade-off with biodiversity loss or co-benefits of biodiversity enhancement. This is where they got to in the 1.5 report. They didn't have a lot of space to talk in there about land, so now this is our job. A few of us in the room also working on the special report on climate change and land, where we're trying to go into this in a bit more detail, pick up the scenarios, look in a bit more detail. What are they really saying about land requirements? What do they really say about the co-benefits and trade-offs? So like I said, please look out for that, please review it, and please help us to make it better. So one thing that I think, just on bioenergy, because I think this will be a nice thing for Maria to pick up on, I don't know if you can quite see this. This is a paper by Anna Harper is involved in, and it touches on this idea of, right, all this BECCS, where does it end up getting grown? And that's what the top graph is showing you. It took one of the IM scenarios and it's looked at where it ended up growing BECCS. And that top graph is showing you where the BECCS ends up growing, and the colouring represents the percent of that grid cell that ends up being covered in BECCS. So the yellow's 0 to 0.25% of the grid cell, the green is 25 to 75% of the grid cell, and the dark green is 75 to 100% of the grid cell. So that's just where the model ends up putting that BECCS. And then we looked at actually what's the land already there. And if you cut that, and if it was forest or whatever the land cover was, and you replaced it with a biomass crop, how many years would it take to pay back the carbon you lost on the land conversion? Here, the redder the colour is the longer time it would take to pay that back, with the dark red being it would take 100 years to pay back that lost carbon, that carbon debt on land conversion. So you can see there's some areas where BECCS ends up on cropland, that there's no carbon debt payback time and it's probably quite efficient to do BECCS. And there's other areas where it might end up on forests or peatlands where it's really not a good idea to do BECCS. So that's all I wanted to show you for now. I think it'll be more productive to answer questions. So large potential role for afforestation, reforestation for wood-based bioenergy within the 1.5 report, if we really want to get to 1.5 and have to throw everything at it. But now it's our job in the report on land to look in a bit more detail about what that really, really means. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Joanne. I'm sure there would be quite a number of questions, but we will leave those questions and answers at the end. And just that we were actually having Roberto next, but as Maria has to rush to catch her flight today, so we just on the spotlight rearranging and having Maria Sanchez with us. Many of you, of course, know Maria, who worked previously in FAO's Forestry Department, leading the work on RED and National Forest Monitoring. Maria has an impressive CV, but just briefly, she's currently the scientific director at the Basque Center for Climate Change in Bilbao. She used to be a senior officer at UNFCC, and she has been also advisor and part of the delegations from Spanish delegation to UNFCC negotiations. She was the one of the authors of the IPCC's 4th assessment report and lead author of several IPCC's greenhouse gas inventory guidelines. Maria,
yes,
over to you.
Yes, I didn't prepare much, so I will just try to add some concerns to what Joe was saying, which sometimes are forgotten. So. I can talk to the mic, no? It's okay?
Yeah, I need to.
Yes, okay. Yes. Yes, so, I mean, basically, you saw what Joe was showing to you, which is the pathways, no? And how they are constructed, so I don't need to go into this detail. Obviously, in these pathways, there are options related to forestry, which become in a different balance depending on which pathway you take, as Joe already indicated. And this is the messages in the summary for policymakers that you are being sort of puzzled about, of this large range of changes in forest area, for example, between 1 million square kilometers to 10 million, depending on which pathway you reach. So those are the things that you are being seen and you are being sort of struggling with. So what I want to point out is this. I mean, all these integrated modeling exercises are global, and they are based on technical potentials. And the point is that the technical potentials assessments of each of the potential options you could put in these portfolios for the pathways are estimated in some literature which is used as a basis. No? So I pick up just one literature, one paper, which is Griscom 2017, which is well known probably by many of you, where you see some of those potentials. And here what you see basically is that reforestation has a large potential, a large range, between 2 to 11 gigatons per year. So that's a large one. And then, of course, if you go, sorry, you go to other like avoided forest conversion, which includes deforestation, is the second one that has a very large potential, right? And this leads you to this wage that Joe was showing to you. But the point here I want to make is that if you take, for example, that's the Spanish data for this paper, right? And they say, you go to the box on there, they say that Spain can sequester 188 million tons per year to 2030, which is half of our emissions, right? So when my minister saw this data, she said, oh, wow, so I don't need to do anything on energy transition or anything like that, no? I can just reforest the whole peninsula and then we solve our problems, right? I mean, you are foresters, right? You have been working on the ground for a while. Do you think this is realistic? No, obviously not. I mean, it is true that those papers are starting to incorporate and are starting to be discussed now, right? So we are discussing with the authors how realistic the potentials were. I mean, they were trying to do their best. We're not criticizing this. And they were trying to include some other benefits, as you see there, no? Like air, biodiversity, water, soil, like Joe was also showing, no? This is something which is an improvement with respect to how we were handling the mitigation potentials and the mitigation estimations on forests. But yet we are simplifying at the global level a lot, right? And we are ending up with these numbers, which sometimes doesn't make sense. So when these data were translated, why it was wrong? Just to illustrate why this number came up like this, no? As an example. You know, you're very familiar. It's activity data per emission factor. Yeah? The forestry department is very familiar with this equation, right? What activity data was used? The activity data was used was a potential restoration map, a global potential restoration map, where in Spain, the forest definition is 25% crown cover. Doesn't match our forest definition. And if I replace everything which is suitable for forest because it has no other land use with plantations, I am having problems with my biodiversity. There is not possible to grow trees in deserts, for example, right? So, I mean, it's not that simple. That's the answer to this question, right? And then the second part of the question is the emission factor. And then I ask, well, what emission factor you were using? And they say, no, a semi-tropical emission factor for all the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, right? And say, yes, well, yes, for this exercise, maybe good, but if I have to take this number to my own reality, that's not what I want to do, right? So then when other papers after these were picking up these emission factors, these technical potentials, they ended up with quite, well, we introduced some caveats in there, so they ended up with more realistic, not yet as realistic as I would like to see, but with the restored forests, mangroves, and peatlands, they came with 4.5 gigatons, which, well, it's half of the range that we got only for reforestation. That's better. Huh? And then the second point I want to make in this context is that yes, we can try to have this materialize, but we are not, and the models are not able to take into account at this point in time the vulnerability of the forest to the present climate change, right? And this is what you have. This is a paper that was published recently, which shows already many places where we are seeing forests are having problems, are having pests, are having diseases which are very severe related to actual climate change facts. No? And I just picked up one, which is the mountain beetle and forest carbon feedback to climate change in Canada, yeah? Where the beetle was spread in the Canadian forest and ended up with 270 million tons of carbon being released to the atmosphere. And one of the reasons why Canada was not able to fulfill the target of the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol was these emissions from forests, right? So you can see that it can become really a problem if you don't take into account that your forests are vulnerable to climate change. Right? The same thing happened also in the US. You also have this beetle burst, you know, in the southern part of Canada. It's spreading also down to the US. And this is a case which is much closer. This is the Basque Country, right? This is the Basque Country this year, where we got half of the plantations, almost half of the plantations of Pinus radiata are affected by this Diostroma pini, which is a defoliator. And we are now calculating that there is almost 1,500,000 trees dead in 6 months, right? So all the reliability on plantations, on conifer plantations in the whole region is questioned now. And what is the reaction of the forest sector? Yes, let's get right away from the Pinus and put eucalyptus, right? Which may lead to another problem. So again, we have to really take very seriously not only how much carbon we want to sequester, but how we want to sequester this carbon. It really matters a lot. And it relates a lot also with the co-benefits that Joe was highlighting before, right? So I think that that's something that you have to bring to this discussion as practitioners, because you are dealing with the reality, is this type of realities. So now it's in the newspapers, it's spread everywhere, you know, and they don't know what to do. And so they don't know if they should extract the wood or not. If they don't extract the wood, we will have a problem with beetles. If they extract the wood, they will have a problem with the price of the wood, and the farmers are really, they don't know what to do now, right? And then my final slide is about that, yes, we can have options, and probably we can understand the trade-offs, and we can sort of get a sense that this option is better than the other one, but putting realistic portfolios that can be implemented by governments at all levels, from municipalities to regions to national governments to some sort of coherency in the multilateral process, is not an easy thing in the land sector. Indeed, it's probably the most difficult thing that we can face, right? So, and you have all sorts of type of options now. You have the forest options of plantations or whatever, or reducing deforestation or whatever, but you also have demand options. You also have the context of that there are large areas, particularly in developing countries, that are community forests. And you cannot deal with community forests in the same way that you deal with other forests in the developed countries, for example, right? So you need to understand how to deal with those things. So my take-home messages are very simple, 3. First, vulnerability, please pay attention to that, because it's going to be a bigger and bigger problem and may jeopardize some of the most promising options that we have in our portfolio, right? So, and that, unfortunately, it's not because they don't want to, but it's very difficult to be picked up by integrated models, these type of things. Then the second thing is complexity and timing. I mean, we're facing complex land use portfolios that has to be implemented at multiple scales with multiple levels of governance, and you have to end up with policy frameworks that are coherent across those scales. And this is not an easy thing to do. If you talk to a politician, that is what the politicians understand, better than us probably, right? So overall, it is not going to be easy to achieve the potentials, even if they are technically realistic. Sometimes we are not being able to produce technically realistic potentials. But please don't be discouraged by that, right? Right? We have to bring the forest sector in, because the consequences of not bringing the forest sector in are going to be worse than to do that. But we have to do that thinking much more carefully how we do that. It's not only about numbers, it's about far more than numbers. And it's about also understanding how government systems work. It's about institutionality. It's about long-term commitment by governments, which is not what usually governments do, right? This is not solved in 3 or 4 years, no. It requires commitments of long-term, 20, 50, 30 years. And it's not going to be achieved tomorrow. It may take more time than we think. So don't be discouraged, please.
Thank you, Maria. Very powerful messages. Robert, over to you. Some commentary remarks I understood you had, so please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can see that I'm wearing my forester's uniform in your honour. I've been asked... go ahead. Grazie. I've been asked to say a few words about what the response from the forest sector might be, based on some research I've been doing variously for the European Commission and for an environmental NGO in Europe, not directly as part of work for the IPCC. And what I want to talk about is what might the response be from the forest sector, what might the strategies be for the forest sector, given that, as Joe House pointed out, forests have multiple contributions to make to society, and even within climate change mitigation, forestry has at least two roles. It has its role as a carbon reservoir and a carbon sink, and it has its role as a provider of wood as a resource which can be used for construction, for artifacts, and for energy. And sometimes these two roles are in support of one another, but a lot of the time these two roles can be in antagonism. And you may well be aware there is a very, very heated debate about how you achieve both roles, or can you even achieve both roles in terms of mitigation? Can you both have your carbon sink and have wood as a resource that you can harvest and use for displacement of greenhouse gas intensive products? To quote a negotiation going on in another sphere, can you have your cake and eat it? So we've been doing quite a lot of work on that and going to a lot of meetings about it. For example, I went to a meeting in March this year in Sweden where the agenda or the title for the meeting was actually included the expression, should we actually leave all the carbon in the forest and stop harvesting, or should we use or maximize production for mitigation? And these are the sorts of, this gives you a flavor for how concerned some people in the forest sector are getting about what the response should be and their level of uncertainty and confusion. So the first thing I want to tell you about is some research we did initially for the European Commission, DG Energy, and subsequently for an environmental NGO called the European Climate Foundation. And this is my one prop for my comments today. This is the report we have produced recently for the European Climate Foundation, which is based on the earlier work for the European Commission. The work for the European Commission was a literature review and a very large life cycle assessment study. So in 3 thick volumes, and you'll see that the NGO report has the benefit of being much thinner. But why did we do this study? Well, what we wanted to try to understand was there are so many reports coming out saying so many different things about whether producing wood for a use as a material or for bioenergy gives you net reductions in greenhouse gas emissions or actually increases greenhouse gas emissions, and Jo touched on this in her talk. What is the truth here? And of course the truth is it's complex. And what we looked at was scenarios in our earlier research for the Commission and in this latest research. We looked at scenarios and we analysed a lot of scenarios and said, well, yes, it's complex, and yes, you can get lots of different outcomes, but you can see there are systematic reasons why you get the different outcomes. And in the subsequent work we did for the European Commission, for the Environmental Climate Foundation, this NGO, what we did was clarify that outcome from the European Commission study to say, well, can we convert that evidence into a set of criteria that we could apply to ensure that, for example, bioenergy could be produced from forests with lower risks of high greenhouse gas emissions and more chance of achieving greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Now, what's interesting about this is that the community is very divided on this. The NGOs generally oppose the idea of bioenergy coming from forests at all, whereas the forest sector is convinced they don't have to do anything and it's perfectly okay to produce bioenergy and it'll be good for climate. The truth, of course, is somewhere in between. And what is interesting is you tend to see these reports supporting one side or the other side of the argument, and so either the NGOs say this is the report or the industry says this is the report. Now, I don't want to try to congratulate myself. I apologize if that's what I appear to be doing. But this report has one support from both NGOs and industry. So for once, there is an example of a study where both sides are saying, yes, that works for us, it makes sense. So you might want to have a look at the analysis that we did and the criteria that we came up with. So that's the first part of my talk. The second comment I want to make is, given that, how much bioenergy can we produce? And particularly because, and how much bioenergy can we produce with low risks of frustrating attempts to achieve greenhouse gas emissions reductions? And I mean achieving that without carbon capture and storage, because I often say in talks that I give, we cannot afford to rely on the carbon capture and storage fairy. You know, we cannot assume that the carbon capture and storage fairy is going to come along and wave her wand and solve this problem. So bioenergy, I think, has to stand on its own feet and achieve greenhouse gas emissions reductions in itself. So another piece of work we've been doing is for a UK government department called the Committee on Climate Change that directly advises the UK government on what its policy should be. And they're doing some work on UK bioenergy policy. They're reviewing it yet again. And what they wanted to know was they'd looked at IPCC literature, which had suggested lots of different numbers for the potential for forests around the world to produce bioenergy. I think it was anything up to 200 exajoules down to a few exajoules. And they said, well, what are we supposed to believe here? We want to tell the UK government how much bioenergy we might reasonably have access to. How can we make sense of these numbers that are so different? So what we've been doing for them is we built a model for them in about 3 weeks scratch. Now, normally when my department build models, we build complicated models in languages like Fortran or C#. This model we built in Excel, Microsoft Excel. And guess what it relies on? It relies on a lot of FAO data. But we basically dumped a load of FAO data into some Excel worksheets, put in some numbers and assumptions of our own, and enabled ourselves to do calculations of bioenergy potentials under different scenarios. And we have lots of little switches in this worksheet, so you can switch in and out different assumptions. So one assumption might be, don't produce bioenergy from primary forests. That's an obvious one. But another one might be, don't allow sawn timber to be used for bioenergy. Wood that can be used for sawn timber, don't use it for bioenergy, at least not initially. So we have all these little switches that we can turn on and off in the worksheet. And some of these switches can be used to implement in the worksheet the criteria in this report. And that's what the Committee on Climate Change were really interested in. If we applied these criteria, how much bioenergy could we produce around the world? So when we crunched the numbers and we estimated the completely unconstrained potential, surprise, surprise, the potential was about 200 exajoules. Then we said, well, no forest is managed for maximum biomass production anywhere in the world normally, unless it's a very industrial plantation. So let's allow for that. And we allowed for that, and the potential came down to about 170 exajoules. Then we applied the criteria in here, and it came down to about 60 exajoules. And now what's happening is another research group are applying the sorts of factors that Maria was talking about in her presentation, the resilience of the forests, the risks to production from disease, and also governance. So they're looking at, okay, this resource might be here, but realistically, how reliably can we produce from this resource on a sustainable basis? So that part of the study has not been done yet. It's being done as I speak, and I expect that number of 60 exajoules to come down a lot as a result of applying those criteria in the workbook. So I just thought you might be interested to hear about that work. We hope to publish that second study at some point. And I thought you might be interested to know how grateful we are for the FAO data that we've been able to call on to produce those numbers. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. I think we have heard three very clear, very passionate presentations. We have a few minutes here for questions, answers. We do have this room available for staying a little bit longer. I understand Joanna can stay a few more minutes. I don't know, Robert, can you stay a few more minutes? I understand if people have other meetings, but let's take at least the first round of questions or comments, and please say your name first and then your question or comment. I see Olivier. Olivier, go ahead. Can you take a microphone?
Olivier Dubois, and I coordinate FAO's work on energy, including bioenergy. But before, I was working a lot on forestry. I wonder if the IPCC has considered mixed land use systems in coming up with some realistic, more realistic scenarios. Of course, the modeling it's difficult for the models to do that. But I think between the models and the responses that we can give, some mixed land use, like a principle of mixed land use systems, might actually be one way forward. Agroforestry, we're combining different purposes for the land. Thank you.
John, let's take a few questions and then we can seek answers to that. So I saw Ben at least there. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ben Davis. I'm the leader of the Strategic Program on Reducing Rural Poverty at FAO. And I guess it kind of follows on the previous question, but I wanted to, and I was struck by the have the cake and eat it as well. And I'm just wondering if we can also throw in the dimension of everyone having a piece of the cake, in the sense of, it is now NGOs and the industry aren't the only stakeholders, in the sense that, 40% of the extreme poor are linked to forests in some way. They're often the guardians of forests themselves, and they don't tend to come into this discussion at all. So I'm wondering how they figure in to all of this. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. Javier?
Hello, this is Javier Garcia. I work for I'm a forestry statistician for the Red Plus team. The largest effort in reforestation of afforestation so far and still going on, if I am correct, is by China. Since the 1960s and 70s, they have shown, or they are shown lately, that, of course, even not taking into account the constraints that Maria mentioned, the capacity of retention of the sequestration of carbon that the forests, the new afforestation programs have, will saturate by 2035, more or less, because of different reasons, because they don't have more space, basically, for afforestation, and because, of course, the forests become mature. So I just wanted to ask Joe, there is a window of opportunity for afforestation and reforestation. It cannot go forever. So what is your take on that?
Okay, let's take these three. I think, Joe, if you'll start.
Okay, so on the mixed land use systems, you're right, that's very difficult for the models to take account of. The integrated assessment models, they have quite basic vegetation models in them. Some of them don't even have vegetation models in them. So it's very difficult for those that are doing these global pathway scenarios to take account of that. There are lots of bottom-up studies, sort of individual site-based studies on this. So all IPCC can do is assess the literature that's out there. So we can't initiate studies ourselves, but we can point out where there's uncertainty and gaps. So both within the special report on 1.5 and the land report, we do have some information in there about afforestation. And I know this kind of idea of sustainable land management and mixing what you're doing on the land for multiple benefits is quite key. In Chapter 6, for example, which is the chapter Giacomo's working on, there's a lot of emphasis on there about sustainable land management and mixed uses. So we are. So I should also say on that special report, it's kind of, governments asked for several special reports and they were thrown together. So there's also quite a focus on desertification, land degradation, food security, as well as the kind of greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation. And then this kind of idea of trade-offs amongst these different purposes. In terms of how Indigenous communities and people as stakeholders fit in, I think that touches back to the point that Maria made. It's really hard. So in terms of the models that we were talking about, she's absolutely right. It's a very technical potential, and it's not including all the barriers. Again, one of the things we're trying to explore in terms of the synergies and trade-offs is some of these issues about how they impact different types of communities. And then also with a chapter on government, so that, how communities, what are the barriers and how you can overcome those. But I agree it's a problem, and it's something in these wild potentials that isn't there in the modelling, but it's something we can talk about and consider. In terms of China, I don't know the details about China, but the point about the window of opportunity is I think quite an important one, because BECCS and some of these other technological solutions are not available now, whereas we can do things in forests now. We have a lot of experience, we have a lot of expertise, we know how to manage forests. And actually doing something with forests now, protecting forests, doing what we can to improve management and to do the kind of thing Robert's talking about, actually buys us a little bit of time, not to do nothing in the fossil fuel and industrial sector, but to get those technologies in line, because a lot of the technologies for bringing those emissions down rapidly, or carbon capture and storage, are going to take a while. And while we're waiting for that, we need to move rapidly, because the longer we leave it, the more we'll have to do later. And I think that's where forests can play a big role.
I think that was a fairly full answer from Joe, so I'm just going to respond very briefly on the question of community engagement, while acknowledging that I'm a non-expert, and we've already heard a speech of witches or fairies. I'm not a wizard either, so I can't wave a wand and ensure that community engagement takes place, and I wish I could. But for example, one area where there is intense argument over the benefits to local communities and the local environment of wood pellet production is actually in the southern US. Now, perhaps not the most vulnerable community on the planet, but it's nevertheless a community. And there have been many studies of this region saying, oh, it's bad, it's good, and so on. But I think what would help in that region, for example, is an LCA study of the impacts of using the forests to produce wood pellets for energy, for example, where you develop scenarios with local people. So, and where the local people are not just the industry and NGO spokespeople who rush to talk to you, but you try to connect with actually the real people who actually have to live there. That's one way you can do it. I admit it's a small step, but it's something. How else can it be done? And this is not in the context of IPCC, but there are at least attempts to certify forests for sustainable management. And I wonder, and those certification frameworks often talk about the importance of community involvement in the management of forests for whatever purpose. And I wonder if one of the keys is to try to include criteria, like we're talking about here, in those frameworks, so that you ensure that it's part of a framework where community engagement is also a requirement of making decisions about how to manage forests. That's the best I can come up with.
I think that's actually music to our ears in the forestry department. One more maybe burning question, if there is, and then I unfortunately probably need to finish. I see several. Yeah, let's take it. Yeah, go ahead.
Sandro Federici, Climate Change Division Consultant. A question, as Maria said, in this analysis, do you take into consideration the fact that the forest will be impacted by the climate change? There was a presentation time ago in Italy in the environmental agency. 2/3 of the Italian forest will be totally out of their, let's say, natural condition by the end of the century. So we don't even know if they will be there. Probably they won't regenerate anymore. Do you take into consideration this when you project the mitigation potential of the forest sector? Thanks.
Yeah, I did see two other hands, but I'm afraid I have received signals that we need to be finishing here. So let's take that, Joanna, I think for you.
Thanks, Sandro. The integrated assessment models don't particularly. Some of them have vegetation models within them. So if they're run with climate, then they can look at where forests might be in the future, but the majority of those scenarios don't. So, you know, where it's producing those biomass maps, it's not particularly taken account of that. And even a lot, when you look at the Earth system models, where they do run with future climate and they do look at the impacts, they're really very focused on the climate and CO2 effects, and they don't tend to do a very good job of fires. Many of them don't have fires, some of them do, but it's not always great. They don't tend to do insects and disease. So yeah, a lot of that is, you know, it's a lot of that potential is not having taken account of these things, but it's something we can look at after the fact.
Okay, thank you. I really like to thank you all for coming on a last minute, and I do apologize for that, but we had difficulties to getting room in FAO, first of all. But I'm really happy to see so many people, not only from the forestry department, but also other departments, SP groups and others, and other colleagues from the IPCC authors meeting. So thank you for that. Thank you particularly Joanne, Robert, and of course Maria already left for their very insightful presentations and giving us a lot of thought, but also encouragement, and clearly pointing out how important role forest has, that we shouldn't be discouraged by these alarming figures. On the contrary, and it just reminds me of a former colleague in the forestry department telling that, you know, if the numbers or models don't fit your reality, change the reality. It's probably a bad joke, but there has a grain of truth in that, and I think that reality change starts from every individual people and our behavior. But with that, I would like to really thanks once again, and thank you all for coming. Thank you, Hiroto, for your opening remarks, and have a nice rest of the afternoon and good weekend. Thank you.